One night in 1998, Francine Jackson was doing her regular job. Now that job happened to be mopping the floor, the 7th floor at Baptist Hospital in Nashville. While she was doing this mopping, she heard something. Now she was used to hearing patients in need and in trouble. After all, as she said to me, telling her story to me in the cafeteria, one day she said, well, you know, hospitals, everybody's suffering there. All the patients come in because they're looking for our help. So she said, I heard an old man calling from his room. And he was calling out for his daughter. And I thought to myself, well, I saw that daughter leave when visiting hours were over. But the man kept calling for his daughter. I looked down the hallway, nurses are busy. Finally, I did something, and she said, Mr. Chapman, I got to tell you, I was kind of scared. She said, I put down my mop. And I walked into the old man's room, and I picked up his hand, and I held it, and he stopped calling out for his daughter. And in maybe a couple of minutes, he fell off to sleep. So she said, I put his hand back down. I walked back out to the hallway, picked up my mop, and went back to work. She said, now, I've heard you talk about loving care. Is that what you mean? That's what we mean. We'd all like to think we give love every day. Are we willing to find that courage to step outside and do the extra little things that mean so much to patients? Why do they matter? Because patients are trapped. They're suffering. They wouldn't come to the hospital if they were doing fine. They come because they are experiencing need. I represent that need with this dark circle, and there's a possibility, there's a choice, there's an opportunity that caregivers have every day. And you know, Francine is clearly a caregiver. Oh, well, she may work in housekeeping, but if you ask patients, they'll tell you that some of the best experiences they had with caregiving were delivered by the housekeeper. So, transactions or sacred encounters. Transactions or encounters. So a transaction is, let's say, patient's lying in bed, nurse walks into the room, and the patient says to the nurse, you know, I got that surgery tomorrow, and boy, I am really scared, and I'm thirsty. Could you get me a drink of water? So here's the need. What are those needs? We got two of them here. Thirsty, scared. And let's say this nurse brings a glass of water, transaction. You know, get a glass of water, deliver to patient. This is a transactional encounter. The sacred encounter comes when the nurse makes a decision to try to share her heart, maybe to give just a few more moments of her time to try to reassure the patient about his or her fears. That may not be in the job description, but that's what happens in healing hospitals. Francine Jackson engaged in what we call a sacred or a meaningful encounter. That's when here's need and here's love. And the sacred or meaningful, if you don't like the word sacred, the meaningful encounter happens right here in this intersection between love and need. Not a transaction, but where love meets need. Now, caregivers are busy. This may seem like we're asking too much. Remember Francine's story? What she said was, I went in, I picked up the man's hand, and in a couple of minutes, he calmed down, went to sleep, seemed better. She went back out and continued doing her job. I asked her, Francine, why were you scared? And she said to me, well, that's not actually my job. I was afraid maybe the supervisor would come along and the supervisor would say to me, Francine, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be in patient rooms. Get back to mopping the floor. Now, if you're the family of the old man, if you're the old man, wouldn't you like that dose of healing, that several cc's of love that Francine gave? Wouldn't you want that for your father, your friend, your mother? Wouldn't you want that for yourself? That's what happens when leaders take responsibility in a healing hospital and they decide to make decisions and go a little outside the rules, the regular way of doing things, to do these extra things. Okay, you don't have to think of this as a ministry. You don't even have to think of your job as a calling. But I can tell you that from that day forward, Francine began to see her job in terms of a very special thought. When I saw her a few weeks later, she said to me, I heard you talking about callings, and I think that's what my job is. And I said, you mean about going into the room? And she said, no, not just going into the room. She said, I think my job's a calling every day. If I keep the floors clean, that helps prevent infection, and that means I'm a caregiver too. I said, Francine, thank you. You know, teaching can be a really boring experience. I didn't like it in school. I went to lots of school. I went to, elementary school and high school and college, and, I kept on going, even though I was a C student. I got into law school, went to law school. Later on, went to divinity school. Classrooms are tough places to learn some of the most important things, right? Right here, you're watching me, listening, hopefully staying awake, and I'm trying to do some things with symbols, trying to do some things with stories, and helping us to understand the enormous power of stories in teaching. Now, why is that? We remember, studies show, we remember only about 10% of what we hear. We remember 20% of what we read, 70% of what we do. But guess what? We remember 90% of what we teach. Every time we're teaching others, we're actually learning. There's a powerful message for leaders and caregivers training others. Teaching is a way of learning. So we invite caregivers and we invite leaders to tell stories. Who else taught like that? Now, this is not about religion, but lots of religions are grounded, let me correct that. All religions are grounded in powerful stories, every single one. It's the narrative of the Muslim, the Catholic, the Protestant, the Jewish, the Buddhist. Every one of those religions has a rich history of stories. I learned about that in law school in a different way. In the first weeks, the professor said to us, what's the first thing you remember as a child? We all kind of looked around, we're all scared. It's first year of law school, actually first semester of the first year, and we want to give the right answer. So in fact, nobody volunteered an answer, and finally he looked back at us and he said, well, it begins like this when you're a little kid. Once upon a time. And he said, do you remember at all how enchanted you may have seemed when your mother or father or a teacher began to tell you a story and they began with that once upon a time line? Kind of like this. Once upon a time, a lawyer approached Jesus. And the lawyer said to Jesus, wait, let me stop right there. Let me just say, I hope those of you who are not Christian are not thinking, okay, here's a Christian story. I don't know if I want to hear that. Just think of this as a regular story to teach about the power of stories And this is one that's 2,000 years old. By the way, those of you who are Christian and think, oh yeah, I know that Good Samaritan story, let's take a look at that story one more time, and let's think of it in the context of these sacred encounters. So, a lawyer walks up to Jesus, and he says to Jesus, you're the great teacher. I got a question for you, and the question is, I want to know how I get into heaven. And Jesus said, you know the answer to that. I guess it's love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus said, that's right. You knew, and that's the answer. Now, the lawyer, being a lawyer, I hate this part because you heard me mention at one point I went to law school. Well, here's one of those lawyers, and he wants to dig deeper, and he says to Jesus, hey, who's my neighbor? Now begins one of the great stories in history. Notice, Jesus did not give a direct answer. Instead, he told a story, and in telling the story, he gave the lawyer and each of us the chance to figure out one of the key questions in life. I mean, unless you don't care about heaven, unless you're not wanting to go, but if you do, you probably want to know, what's that mean? Love God and love your neighbor. So here's what Jesus said. He said, a priest was walking down the road one day, and out of the corner of his eye, he notices a wounded man, a man suffering by the roadside. Even though he's a priest, he doesn't stop. He walks right on by. He doesn't even engage in a transaction. He's able to love and hear his need, but he passes up that opportunity. Well, a little while later comes a second person, and the second person sees the wounded man, but of course he doesn't stop either. He's probably got his excuses. Jesus doesn't tell us, but we can guess maybe the second person says, hey, the priest didn't stop, why should I stop? Okay, now comes the third person who happens to be a Samaritan, and the Samaritan looks over, and we were meant to understand that the wounded man and the Samaritan are in different tribes, and there's a challenge right there. But the Samaritan, on his animal, stops, gets off his animal, goes down, and helps the suffering man, the beginning of a sacred encounter. In fact, it's already happened, because the Samaritan stepped away from his path to risk helping another. Is that like the housekeeper and the old man a little bit? Now, what does the Samaritan do? He helps the man up, tends to his wounds, puts him on his animal, and he walks, leads the animal with the wounded man on board to a nearby inn. At the inn, he goes to the innkeeper and takes out his own money, and the Samaritan pays for the wounded man to spend the night. After maybe a couple days, the Samaritan has to leave, but his mission isn't over yet. He decides to leave money with the innkeeper and says, I'll be back. Meanwhile, look after the wounded man. So you know what Jesus says to the lawyer after he ends that story? Who is your neighbor? The lawyer gives his answer, and we know what he picks, and we know what you would pick. Stories, parables, teaching. The shortcut is when someone asks you a question, you give an answer right away. The longer cut, just a little longer, is the one that endures. Find a story. Use a story to answer a question. Use it as a basis for discussion. And in that comes the chance to spread the message of radical loving care, of loving leadership, of building a culture in which everyone wants to open their hearts, use their hands, deliver high compassion as well as high competency. We need to notice one particular thing. Every one of these stories, every one of these meaningful encounters, if you're uncomfortable calling them sacred, every one of these meaningful encounters is about doing the extra things. Those things that seem small, but to the person receiving the care, to the one in need, they're gigantic. They're the kinds of things that signal to the individual, the person lying isolated, alone, suffering, they signal to that individual amidst all of this machinery and all these patients and in the middle of, these linoleum floors and these cold fluorescent lights and the fact that I'm not home, in the middle of all that, I am a human being. And human beings need love. So meaningful encounters, sacred encounters take place when the extra thing occurs, when we recognize and affirm the humanity of another.